Welcome back everyone. In this video, we're going to create an interaction system inside Unity using Unity's new input system. So we're going to go over raycasts, we're going to go over interactions, Unity events, so we can expand upon the system a lot easier, as well as interfaces, classes, and some object-oriented stuff as well. This is the same interaction system I used inside the game kit that I made. Link to that is in the description if you want to check that out. If you keep coming back to my videos, make sure you like and subscribe and join the Discord. We're building a really great community there as well. The code to download everything inside this tutorial will be available on Patreon. Link to everything will be again in the description. Let's get straight into it. So I'm inside Unity. I'm on the sample 3D third person character template that Unity provides. You can open this project from Unity Hub. It's completely free. And the reason I'm using this template is just so we can cut out the whole character controller stuff and focus entirely on interactions. So let's get straight into the code. You want to create a scripts folder inside your assets folder. I already have that because it's part of the template. We're going to open up the scripts folder. Inside scripts, we're going to create a new folder. And let's call this interactions. Inside the interactions folder, we're going to create 3 scripts. Let's just start with the one and we will create the other 2 later on. So we're going to create a C# script and let's call this for the interaction. We're going to attach this script to our player. And let's open that up in our editor. By default, Unity is going to generate this stuff and get rid of all of this. And we can get rid of all of this. Cool. Inside here, we're going to need 3 functions. We need a private void awake. We need a private void on enable. And we need a private void on disable. And actually, we need one more function, and that's the actual interact function. So we'll have private void on interact. Now, these functions should be pretty self-explanatory, but we'll go over them real quickly. So the on enable, on disable is important so that we can subscribe and unsubscribe from events, just like you should subscribe to this channel. New Unity input system works pretty much like delegates does in C#. We have to have a private player input, and we'll just call this player input. And that's so that we can actually access the input. Now this by itself doesn't do anything. We need to actually store a value onto it. That's why we do player input equals get component player input. Now, a lot of you are probably saying, why can't I just say get player input every time? Get component is very, very slow. Well, it's not that slow. It still executes quite fast in real time. But when we're dealing with programming, it's very, very slow. And we don't want to use it that much. We use it once at the start. We don't have to use it ever again. And then we can move on to subscribing and unsubscribing from events instead inside our enable functions. Now, what we need to do is have our onInteract function be called every single time we press the interact key from our player input. To do that, we have a really fancy line for the new input system, and it looks like this. We have player input dot actions. We choose the action. In our case, the action is going to be called interact. Make sure you remember how this is spelled. Case also matters. We're going to use this later on inside our input asset. And then we can access the performed events, and we want to use plus equals to add a listener, and we're adding the onInteract method. That's going to give us an error. Get rid of the 2 parentheses, and you can do control full stop. And that will bring us this little menu. Make sure you select change signature of method. That's going to auto generate these parameters for you, and make sure you add a semicolon as well. If it's not control full stop, sometimes it's alt enter, or maybe if you just right click it, it changes per IDE. Otherwise, feel free to just type it out. It's not that much either. And we want to copy that line and put the same thing inside on disable, except plus equals is now minus equals because we're removing the listener. And this function is going to do our raycasts for us. And for now, let's just test that the input does work. So we'll say debug.log interact. We'll get rid of this line in a second. That doesn't matter. Let's jump straight back into Unity for now and set up the input action asset as well. Now, if you don't have an input action asset, you want to create one of those first. In my case, I already have one. And so I'm just going to open that up. And here we want to add an action. Action is called interact, just like how you spelled it in your code. We want to add a binding. So click this empty box here, press listen, and you can just press E on your keyboard and select E keyboard, tick keyboard and mouse. Let's add another binding. and let's bind it for gamepad, and let's do button west. And you can tick Xbox controller and PS4 controller. Button west is usually your X button on Xbox. Make sure you press save asset and you can close this screen after that. Cool. Now you can select your player. In my case, this is our player. And I'm just going to go add component interaction right there. And now if I open up the console and press play, every single time I press E on my keyboard. Okay, so I was getting an error. I changed on interact to do interact. I literally changed the method name and that seemed to have fixed my error. I think that's probably just on my side. I don't know what was going on. There's probably a Unity thing going on in the background, but you probably wouldn't have got that error. If you did, maybe try restarting Unity or try renaming your function. Apparently that works. Now, if I press E, we can see that we have interact coming up in our console, which is good. We have the key binds working. So the next step would be to get the raycasts working. So we can write the raycast script and then we can dive into actually making the box do interaction stuff. The raycast script is not too difficult. I know raycasting can be a little bit confusing, but we'll take it step by step. So to do the raycast, we're going to write physics.raycasts. If you're doing this in 2D, it would be physics2d.raycast. And we can see here from the, it just disappeared, but the first parameter is the root position of our raycast, the starting point. So we choose a starting point, we choose a direction, and we shoot a ray infinitely towards that direction, and we have a bunch of other parameters we can customize for so that we get the right output. So the root position is going to be our transform.position, but we don't want to do this because transform is similar to saying get component, so we want to have a reference saved to transform. So we'll have private transform underscore transform, and inside awake we can just have underscore transform equals transform. Just like that, and then this can be underscore transform.position. But what you might find with your character, especially in my case, is the root position is at the player's feet, which is not ideal because the raycast will not actually hit the cube there. We want it to be maybe around the player's waistline, so let's add a bit of offset to the starting position. So we can add vector3.up, and that's going to offset the position of the raycast by 1 unit in the up direction. Now, if we don't want it to be 1 exact unit, we can multiply this by some decimal number like 0.3, which will lower a little bit more. This is diving into more of the vector math side of things. It's not too complicated, but if you're not understanding this, I highly recommend you read up on vector and 3D math stuff. We also want to add a forward offset just so we're starting it from a little bit further than the player's initial position. And that's just so we can avoid colliding with the player as well. So we can do that just by saying plus transform.forward. And again, we can add some sort of decimal number multiplication here so that we're not going 1 unit too far. So let's just multiply this by 0.2. Now the next parameter is the direction. In our case, it's just transform.forward. And then we want to have a reference to whatever we hit. So we can write out var hit. The next parameter is the length of the ray. So we'll just make it 1.5. And then we have the final parameter, which is the layer mask. In our case, we're going to create a layer mask in a second. So we'll have a reference up here. Let's have serialized field private layer mask, and we'll just call this interactable layer. Just like that. And here we can pass in interactable layer. Cool. So this function, physics.raycast, returns a boolean if we hit anything. So if we didn't hit anything, there's no point doing the rest of the function. So we can have if not physics.raycast, all that fun stuff, then we can have return. Cool. So what this does is we do a physics raycast. If we hit something, output the hit. Otherwise, if we didn't hit something, if not, then return. And what return does, it exits this function, so the rest of this code doesn't get executed. So we can, for example, move this down here because this is only going to log interact if we actually hit an interactable. But we don't know if we hit an interactable. All we know from hit is that we hit something. And this is when we have to jump across now to the interactable side instead of the player side. So inside the interactions folder, I'm going to create another script. And let's just create a class interface, and let's call this interactable object. Now, interactable object is going to be a mono behavior class so that we can attach it to a game object. But it's also going to inherit an interface, and we'll create the interface now as well. So here we'll call it interactable. There's two I's there because it's an interface. I'll create a class just so I can show you guys how we convert this to an interface. Instead of public class, it's public interface. And that's it. Now, why do we need an interface and why do we need the objects and what's the difference? I'm going to put some links inside the description to where you can find out more about interfaces, classes, records, structs, all that sort of stuff, because there's a whole bunch of stuff in programming which you probably don't usually cover using Unity. Now, our interface is going to basically be a blueprint to what an interactable object should do or should have. So the first thing every interactable object should have is a function to do the interaction. So we will have a public void called interact. And this is a fancy function because you'll see that we don't actually have curly brackets here. It's essentially an abstract function, even though we don't put abstract here. We can, there's no need because it's an interface anyway. The whole thing is abstract. If I did this a class, this would actually be an error because it's not abstract. So it must declare a body. If we put abstract here, that would fix it. But to do an abstract method, we have to do an abstract class. Now, the next thing our interface needs is something to store what we should do when we interact, and that's our Unity events. Let's create a public Unity event and take note that it actually added this namespace using Unity engine.events. If it doesn't add that, make sure you add that, otherwise you will have an error on the Unity event. This is going to be a property, so we'll have get. We need to give it a name, of course. And let's call this on interact. And now we have to make this get protected sets. Protected is different from private in that private means only this interface or this class can use that thing. Protected means this interface and this class and its children can use this thing. To use the interface, we can say mono behavior and interactable. That's going to give us a error saying, yo, you're doing something terribly wrong. So we can just click anywhere on this red line and do control dot again, or alt enter. And then you can do implement missing members. Make sure all the boxes are ticked and press OK. That's going to generate this code for you. If it doesn't generate the code, feel free to type it out yourself. It's not that much. So in short, our interact method should just call the onInteract method. So we can do a lambda expression to this and say onInteract.invoke. And that's going to make this thing do stuff. So that we can edit this, we want to make this a serialized field. So we'll just say serialized field, private Unity event on interact. And that means it's going to show up in the inspector so that we can customize it. Jump back into Unity. There's a few things we should do so that we can keep up with our code. The first thing I want to do is select our interactable cube. And we have to put this on the interactable layer. I've already done it, but to do that, you can go on the layer, drop down, press add layer, and on layer 10 or the next available layer, just type interactable. The name doesn't matter too much. And then on your player, here we have the drop down for interactable layer. Make sure that you have ticked interactable. You don't need to tick anything else. In fact, don't tick anything else because this is what guides the raycast to hitting stuff. So what this means is that our raycast will not collide with anything except objects which have the interactable layer on them. The next thing we should do is click on our cube and go add components, and I want to add interactable object as a component, and you'll see that this gives us this really cool interface on our inspector. This might look quite similar to what you see with Unity's user interface buttons, and that's exactly what it actually is. It's a Unity event. So we can press this plus arrow to add to the list. And for example, what we might want to do is make the box disappear. So let's select the mesh renderer, function, mesh renderer, and let's have bool enabled false. So now when we interact with the cube, the box will disappear. We can't disable the collider because that means then we can't turn it back on. But the benefit of this is that you can add anything to this list. In our case, just so you can visualize it, I'm making the box disappear, but there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do here. You can add other objects to it. So if you want to interact with this and make another object disappear, you can do that. If you want to have the player disappear, you can do that. You can do anything, really. Now, everything on our code side is actually pretty much set up. The only thing left to do is obtain this function from whatever we're interacting with from the raycast and call it. That's it. And that's inside our do interact method down here. So what we want to do is check if the object we hit on the interactable layer has the interactable object script. If it doesn't, ignore it. If it does, call that method. So we're going to have another escape case here. We're going to write if not hits.transform dot, we'll have try get component. And we're going to output the interactable object and we'll call it interactable. And then return. So this might be some fancy syntax you might not have seen before. Essentially what we're doing is we're going to check if we can get the component. Try get component is a method which returns a boolean. If we can get the component, it's going to return true. If we can't, that means the component's not on that object, it's going to return false. If we can get the components, it's going to return true and output that component. And we're going to call the output component interactable. It's the exact same thing that we did here with var hit. And so the only thing left to do now is say interactable. And interactable again is the component we obtained from that object dot interact. You'll see the method down here. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. That's literally all you have to do. Here we go. Let's walk up to this cube, press E. And the box is gone. Obviously, we can still stand on it because the collider is still there, but that's it, really. Your interaction system is done. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, but what if I want to bring the box back, right? Because making a box disappear is pretty easy, but how do I make it come back? Essentially, what we want to do now is create a switch so that we can turn the box on and off, which is a variation of interactions. Now, there's a few ways you can do this. You could create another interface which inherits from this interface. You could create another class which inherits from this interface, which inherits, you know, there's a whole different direction you could take this. In our case, to make this as straightforward as possible, I'm going to rename interactable object to switch interactable. So now we're going to treat this interactable object as if it's a switch and that's it. Now, that doesn't make sense in the case down here because we're going to out switch interactable. What if we have a different type of interactable? So we're going to rename this to iInteractable. And that means anything which inherits the iInteractable interface, we're going to regard it as something that we can interact with. So now if you wanted to have a switch interactable, you can have a switch interactable. If you want to duplicate this class and call it button interactable, for example, which does the same thing but slightly different, you can do that as well. And you can essentially build upon this in many different directions to create many different variations of interactions. So to make this a switch, we have to have some pretty straightforward variables. We'll have a serialized field, private Unity events. And we'll call this stop interact. So stop interact is going to be called when we're stopping to interact, on interact when we initially interact, and to determine which one we use, we have a private bool and we'll call the bool is on. Now our interact method is not as straightforward. So we have to modify this a tiny bit. the first thing we should do is check if it is currently on. So if is on, we should then do stop interact because it's currently on. So we should stop interacting with it. Otherwise, then we should just do on interact dot invoke. And we can get rid of these. We don't need them. And then the last thing we should do is toggle is on. So is on equals the opposite of is on. And we can just do that like that. And that is it. So now when we jump back into Unity, we have another similar sort of drop down list here for the stop interact method. So essentially what we'll do is copy the exact same thing. We can choose the mesh renderer and go bool enabled and ticket. Now the other thing you could do is actually change the material, change color. There's a whole bunch of stuff you could hard code as well. But in our case, this should get the job done. So if I walk up to this cube, I can press E, box disappears, press E, box comes back. And that is it. We have interactions set up. So you'll see it's not actually that hard to get interactions working in Unity, especially to create an expandable system like this. It's very, very helpful. Now you could build upon this tutorial in any way that you want, really. If you want tooltips appear, you can do that. So if you walk up to the cube, maybe the cube highlights and it says press E to interact or something. You could do a whole bunch of stuff. But that just about does it for this video, guys. I will catch you guys in the next one. Again, the code for the tutorial will be on Patreon. Link to that will be in the description. And join the Discord if you haven't already. That being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one.